Good. So we will concentrate now on page 34, on the second paragraph, more or less at the beginning of the second paragraph. And we see that in the year 1904, after defending his doctoral thesis on the topic of discontinuity, he was offered the job of mathematics teacher at the University of Moscow. But he turned it down so that he could properly cultivate his theological interests. We had already seen this development that was happening in this young Pavel Florensky, and especially the encounter with the church, right? Through the Starit. That's why he was from 1904 to 1908 enrolled in the Theological Academy of Moscow. And once he had the degree in theology, so after he graduated from his theology studies in September 1908, he was given the history of philosophy professorship at the School of Theology, where he would engage in his job as a professor until 1921. So we see that for some time he was dedicated to teaching. And he was sucked into new crises that lead him to face what he calls his professor's Phariseeism. So here we could say Florensky, in the environment of teaching, will have to face also new crises. These new crises that he summarizes in what he calls his professor's Phariseeism. So he will be able to come out with a great ascetic effort and with the help of his beloved Starek Isidore. Why? Because it was Holy Father Isidore who definitely told him about Christ's light. And that left a permanent mark on his enthusiasm with the experience of the beauty of spiritual life. So here Florensky acquires through Father Isidore the beauty of spiritual experience. And this means that, in this sense, he will overcome some prejudices that as a professor he might have still had, and he would assume sometimes some narrow or incomplete positions. And having been restored then, the period of his intense scientific work begins, of the exercise of his philosophical passion, and of his mature family and ecclesiastical commitment. So, indeed, we see that through the experience of spiritual beauty and through the figure of Father Isidore, of Starek Isidore, Florensky acquires the proper maturation that he needs. So, what we see here is precisely what we had talked about during the last class. It's not only something that Florensky gets through books, but for the most part through a personal encounter with a witness of this living truth. And this is what leads him finally to this environment of maturation, in such a way that on August 23rd, 1910, he got married to Anna Jusientova. It was his wife, his wife, who urged him to become a priest, being ordained as a deacon on April 23rd, 1911. And consecrated as a presbyter the following day. And on June 13th of that same year, his first son was born, Vasily, who died in 1956, followed by Kiri, who died in 1982, Olga, who is still alive, Mikhail, who died in 1961, and Maria Tinati, who is also still alive. So what we see is that in this maturation, there are two fundamental factors about Florensky that come into play. First, the priesthood, and then marriage. Or in this case, the other way around. First, marriage, and then priesthood. So here, we see a fundamental aspect as well that's worth mentioning. Father Pavel shows us how marriage and priesthood are not at odds with one another. They are not entirely separated in a categorical way, but that they can constitute a fundamental option for the beauty of spiritual experience taken by a particular man. In this case, by the very Pavel Florensky. So now that if we go to page 35 in the fourth line, we see that between the years 1914 and 1917, exactly during these complicated pre-revolutionary years, pre-communist and pre-Bolshevik, he actively participated in the cultural and religious Russian life as an ecclesiastical soul of a group of intellectuals that were looking for a dialogue between intelligence and the historical church, and all this while forming cultural and religious societies. So, what we see is that ultimately, Florensky is also a great promoter of communion. Just as much as in his life, for example, we find a perfect communion between marriage and priesthood, integrated, in this sense, as part of a fundamental reality. In the same way, his intellectual activity will try to have dialogues, access points, or encounter points between what could be considered as this particular time's intelligence that was severely critical of Russia's religious reality, and to also build these bridges, as we said, with regards to the historical church, right? To have the intellectual and the spiritual come together, to try to reach again this integral unity. And among these partners in the struggle, we can mention Nicholas Berdyaev, Sergei Bulgakov, Truvahov, and Nestorov, right? Among others. But in the year 1917, the Russian Revolution broke out. And from that moment, from that fact, Florensky and his family started going through a very hard time. Why? Because, remember, with the triumph of the October Revolution, right? Red October, where the Bolsheviks rise to power. And by the way, Bolshevik in Russian means majority, as opposed to the Mensheviks or minority. And that, as a matter of fact, they were never a majority. You can see that by the amount of peasants that were oppressed by this compact bloc, pseudo-majoritarian or pseudo-Bolshevik. They take first and foremost a deeply anti-clerical stance, and basically anti-Christian. So here, the persecutions begin, systematic persecutions of any intellectual that wasn't for or that wouldn't support the system, the Soviet system, of any artist that was looking to keep his spiritual freedom, and of course, of every religious person who was in any way related to the Orthodox Church. And so the persecution begins. And listen to this. Until 1933, and since 1917, Father Pavel, unwilling to emigrate, will have to combine his priestly activity with the scientific and technical collaboration in different institutions of the new state. So, what we see is that here also Florensky will show that this communion will also integrate faith and politics. Thus, church and state. That is one of the aspects, for example, that today we usually divide. We think of them as two disciplines that should be sufficiently differentiated and also even separated. But not to Florensky. He takes his own personal reality, his own personal Christian reality, as a priest that with his intellectual capacities collaborates in the intellectual projects of the state. What we see then is that he doesn't run away from difficult obligations, in spite of there being tensions, right? In spite of the difficulties or miscomprehensions, Florensky doesn't run away from difficult obligations. And we see here as well, this paragraph, about 5 lines before it ends, we see that there's a moment when Florensky decides to start reading thoroughly various conferences that defend religious works of art. These religious works of art will be taken precisely as cultural heritage. Why? Because, remember, now with the new Soviet establishment, only something that was social would be considered art, which means that it had to have some kind of social impact, and that would somehow exalt the work, in this case, of the members of the party. an art that they would call realist. A realism that would oppose the materialistic and atheistic reality of this bloc, and that they considered religious works of art as ultimately elements that should be definitely removed from this new Soviet culture. Florensky didn't think so. He would defend them, as we saw, through these conferences as cultural heritage. And he will fight something that he did for his entire life as a true guardian of memory. And why a guardian of memory? Because even this communist regime was actually looking to annihilate the fundamental continuity of culture through the establishment of a project that wanted to definitely break away from any sort, in this sense, of established tradition, right? And particularly Christian. And Florensky, precisely, is going to promote an education for the new generations in a spiritual worldview and culture that he will call realist, contrary to the illusionism of the modern age. So, here we see how Florensky, with this communion, even going through this tense and complicated sphere of faith and politics, of church and state, he also chooses to carry out an enormous educational program. Here also, the figure of pedagogue Florensky makes an appearance, right? The pedagogue that walks along with the students through a fundamentally enriching journey. So, right, what he thought was that culture, in this sense, should be preserved. It should be maintained, ultimately, as an offering of richness to be received by younger generations. These young people that were on their way, and according to Florensky, they couldn't be in any way deprived from a spiritual view of life and of culture. A contrary view, of course, to the alleged scientific realism that was being promoted and defended. So, this illusionism, basically, will acquire very particular features in Florensky, especially the illusionism that has to do with rationalistic idealism. Thus, to suppose that reality depends ultimately on the very human rationality, either a technified rationality or a rationality that's expressed based on specific technological achievements, as it was going on in Moscow with the boom of industrial production, as the implementation of railroads and of the industry in general, or else a rationalistic idealism that would in turn suppose that reality itself was nothing more than the product of human subjectivity, right? That reality was nothing more than the subjective projection of human thought. So, Florensky will be opposed and will say that this education depends basically on a spiritual view. And this spiritual view, indeed, is deeply rooted in memory, and therefore in tradition. Okay, is everything clear? Right? Okay. As it is rooted now in this tradition, we see at the beginning of the next paragraph that in 1919, for example, he starts to work at the plastic material factory Carblet as an advisor, and then he's in charge of production. In 1921, he worked as a researcher at the Glav-Electro Research Laboratory, collaborating in Russia's electrification, and at the same time engaging in his activities as a presbyter. So, it would seem now as though, in this sense, Florensky could still handle both his priesthood aspect and his other aspect, in this case, human. Right, his reality as inserted in this particular culture that he can still handle together precisely with this priesthood that he willingly decided to take on. But as we see on page 36, the beginning of the next paragraph, the following year, 1928, this religious persecution of the Soviet government struck against St. Sergius Monastery of the Trinity that was considered as a cradle of clerical obscurantism by the dominating power. And why? Well, because it was supposed that this monastery, as the Orthodox Church in general, and Christianity, were a source of obscurantism. Or in short, it just didn't go well with the communist system, with the Soviet power. So they were going to strike against it. And on May 21st of the same year, 28, Father Pavel was arrested as a socially dangerous element, suffering a 3-year sentence that was reduced to 3 months thanks to the intervention of Maxim Gorky's ex-wife. Right? So, we see how Florensky is now here arrested for the first time. But what was really the reason behind his arrest? That he was a presbyter. The simple fact of being a priest. So anything that doesn't fit with the system is considered as a dangerous element for the system. And what are they looking for? Precisely, to completely eradicate any sort of merely possible threat for this system. In such a way then, that this Soviet regime is not only going to try to do justice with the real enemies of the party, but with anyone that could eventually become one. So they are not only focusing now only on people that could somehow be identified as enemies of the party, but they instead act preemptively, and they try to make even the very possibility disappear before they go against the system. And that's why Florensky was considered a socially dangerous element. Now, after this, Florensky was exiled to Nizhny Novgorod, where he worked on studies on radioactivity, and his scientific and writing activity continued, developing the concept of the pneumatosphere, based on the noosphere that was developed by his academic friend Bernatsky. And what does this mean? The noosphere was something like, considering these kinds of studies that they were doing, it was something like a fundamental portion that made reference to the intellectual comprehension or scientific rationalism. But Florensky will attribute to this noosphere the counterpoint of the pneumatosphere. And so the pneumatosphere would be then something like a reminder that reality does not only depend on merely man's rational capability, but also on the presence of the spiritual. Then, in 1929, he can then go back to Moscow, and he gets back his previous job, and he gets access to new technical jobs. And he will spend a lot of time working on technical and scientific projects at the Work and Defense Council of the USSR. Now, the life of this tireless worker, of an uncommon creative genius, will be put to the test in a very hard way during the last stage of his existence, that begins in the arrest of 1933. So, from that moment on, 1933, we have what would mark the beginning of Florensky's hard trial. The accusations as an enemy of the people. Listen, and this is a stratagem, because now they're not only talking about an enemy of the party, but of the people's enemy. Because being labeled people's enemy meant that he was supposedly against the reality of the whole country. It was a deceptive way of saying that he was dangerous for everybody, and not only for the ones that were at that time members of the party. So, to say that he was the people's enemy was to falsely compromise every citizen, or to look for complicity, so that everyone would feel threatened. So this became increasingly bigger, and the tolerance for someone like an Orthodox priest was increasingly lower, especially in scientific activities. Thus, while Florensky was looking for a communion even between church and state, what the Soviet regime was looking for was to completely annihilate these two aspects, because the church insisted on the spiritual and the state on the technical. So, they would think that a simple priest couldn't possibly have the capability to work on the technical and scientific projects of the Soviet state. That's why, on February 26, he was arrested for being a member of the inexistent Party for Russia's Rebirth. Thus, something that we need to take into account is that this Soviet regime is primarily an immense network of lies and hypocrisies. The accusations were false. The alleged parties that he was supposedly a member of were inexistent. It was basically about generating some sort of mass hysteria in which everybody would just basically go into a panic situation, constantly being threatened by inexistent realities, and besides, under false accusations, supported by the false confession of Professor Ulyanov. So, considering this, we can see that even the accusations were forced. They were obliged, under pressure. Florensky decided, not to deny the accusation, sacrificing, hence, his own destiny, so as to not hinder the release of some prisoners. In short, Florensky gets to realize that, in order to really have memory taken as a tradition, a sacrificial victim is necessary. And here we see now how indeed Florensky starts to manifest in a very clear and blunt way this sacrificial spirit elevated to extraordinary heights in the last moments of his life. Now, a declaration by Father Pavel makes the spiritual sense of this painful choice manifestly clear. So it's not merely a heroic gesture, as to say that he's defending his countrymen or offering himself. No, it's a very painful decision, but that carries a spiritual sense. Why? Florensky tells us. He says, "There have been righteous men who have sharply warned about sin and the evil in this world, and who have not in their conscience separated themselves from such corruption. Thus, in short, there have been some who were fully aware of the lamentable state of this world's conditions, right? A state of injustice, of corruption, and they don't separate themselves from this situation. They affirm it, but they don't walk away from it. But, says Florensky, with great pain, they have taken upon themselves the responsibility for everyone's sin, as if it were their own personal sin, because of the irresistible strength of the particular structure of their personality." So here, what Florensky indeed mentions is that this sacrificial victim comes about due to his own personality. We could say that personality is not the human profile that persons in themselves possess, but instead an acquired personality due to their communion with the truth. This means that hence, indeed, Florensky notices that this thing we call personality is not, as I said, the human profile defining the characteristics of a particular individual, but rather that this personality is this particular quality acquired through communion with the truth. Thus, this deep transfiguration of human reality we find at the beginning of the next paragraph. On July 26, he was sentenced to 10 years of Lager. The word Lager is German, and it refers to a certain kind of labor camp, right? And that in Russia goes by the name of Gulag, spending 6 months in the terrible prison of Lubyanka. The Lubyanka was located in the center of Moscow, and many intellectuals of the time would call it the eye that sees everything, because it was terrible. It looked as an iron fortress in which, for example, once the gates were open, if a car came in carrying prisoners, they were not to be seen ever again, and nobody knew what happened inside, because nobody would ever come out to report what happened inside. There were rumors about people working there, but it was, let's say, like the fundamental eye that would control and watch everybody no matter whom. And on December 1st, 1936, he's put in the lager, the Gulag, of Savodonich in eastern Siberia, where he was given more scientific projects. So, in spite of having been imprisoned, as we saw, with false accusations and injustice, and so on, even so, they're still profiting from Pavel's potential, and they give him new scientific projects. And something that should call our attention is that not even in the forced labor camps is his creativity exhausted, nor is his desire to sow in culture, by means of experiments and scientific discoveries, showcasing his integral worldview. So we see how this personality, acquired by his communion with the truth, transforms him into a sower. A sower of truth. A sower of truth. That is deeply committed to this integral worldview that he has experienced and that he wants to share with the whole world. Thus, the overcoming of precipitated limitations. Now, on February 10, 1934, he's transferred to the camp of Shkorodvino. And here, he engages in research that would later be published by his collaborators. And this research he was doing was about perpetual ice. And, 2 lines below, we see that thanks again to a new intervention by Gorky's wife, he was able to have a last encounter with his wife and small children in the summer of 1934. This was the last time, this summer of 1934, that he could have a last encounter with both his wife and his small children. On August 17, he's unexpectedly locked in an isolating prison cell until September 1st, the same day that he was transferred now to the Gulag of the Solovki Islands on the White Sea. These Solovki Islands, that are located at the furthest northwestern part of Siberia by the Siberian tundra, used to be a monastery. And this, we should say, is not entirely fortuitous, since by the end of his life, Florensky realizes that his dreams came true, but not the way he expected. Why? Because he said that he wanted to spend his last days in a monastery. And indeed, he spent his last days in a monastery, but turned into a prison. This is a really striking situation. And on the islands, these Solovki Islands, the sacred space of an ancient monastery had now come to be the setting of the most terrible of the repression camps of the Stalinist regime. Indeed, it was actually acknowledged that these islands, the Solovki Islands, were, we could say, the most terrifying and disturbing place in all the entirety of the repression that the Stalinist regime was undertaking. Thus, to be transferred to the Solovki Islands was the worst thing that could happen to a prisoner. So really, being transferred to the Solovki was a one-way ticket. It was characterized by the severity, first simply just by the geographical environment, in addition to the inhumane cruelty by everyone in this gulag. And from September 12 to October 12, he's locked up again in an isolating cell. And why? Because the primary function of this isolating confinement was to weaken the psychological resistance of the prisoner. Thus, to crush him, ultimately, psychologically, until eventually breaking him. So, to put it briefly, the purpose of this isolation was to break their spirit, to nullify in them any possibility whatsoever of human manifestation, to eventually nullify them and completely break them because of the terrible oppression that they are forced to endure. And nonetheless, we see that on November 15, he starts to work at a local establishment on the extraction of iodine, and because of that, engaging in the study of seaweeds. So, what we see here is a fundamental factor of the personality that Florensky now manifests. This sower of truth is only occupied with bearing fruit. In spite of, let's put it like this, the cruel and inhumane conditions in which he lives, he doesn't get carried away by some kind of precipitated resignation or even some kind of disdain for what he's living. But instead, he continues to be faithfully devoted to his commitment, and he tries, to the extent that it's possible for him, to keep bearing fruit. Because to Florensky, to bear fruit, in the sense, means to defend culture. To defend and to preserve culture. This culture that extends to everything that's universally human. To defend and to preserve culture. Always for others. And during the following 2 years, from 1935 to 1936, he took, in the Gulag, lessons in mathematics, technology, and in the chemistry of seaweeds. So we can see, even in the Gulag, he's still a great educator, right? And through this education, also a great promoter of this spiritual worldview that consists of precisely, or entails, the defense and preservation of culture for the benefit of everyone else. Now, his numerous letters, written in extreme conditions, and that are additionally extremely beautiful and extraordinary, there are some of these letters available to us in Spanish through this book that I told you about by Eunsa, that's titled Cartas de la Prisión y de los Campos, since they are transferring him continuously. They really constitute a pedagogical monument and the high point of his whole work. And indeed, it's interesting how Florensky, in spite of these conditions that he was put through in his existence, he cannot continue to engage in his work and his scientific research and so forth. He now summarizes all of his combined thought precisely through this profile, right? Narrative style that we can see in the letters. In fact, in them, the convict takes care of procuring with delicacy and optimism, and more surprising the bigger the distance was, and the reasons to despair, the education of every one of his children. So what we see is that indeed in his letters we find a great pedagogical monument. Because now, what Pavel is interested in, and this is what we had already seen, is to follow the same path of the beauty of spiritual experience that Holy Father Isidore had shown him and had introduced him to defend and preserve culture for others means also to take on the fundamental role of spiritual fatherhood. And this spiritual fatherhood means that we're also called to look after our children. And who are the children? Our continuators. So, here we see now how Florensky's expectations now open more widely by acknowledging that we cannot suppose that our life ends just with the things that we have done, but that the things that we have done are nothing more than, in this sense, the preparation or establishment of a path that the ones that are still to come are called to follow. So, our continuators, it's in them precisely where the future lies, what is still to happen. Thus, we then, as Christians, have an obligation and a commitment with the future. In our existence, there's also a great commitment with the future. Why? Because in the things that we live and the things that we do, the whole generation that will follow us is then compromised. All of them that will ultimately come after us. And if we do not defend the truth in the conditions that we are living in, the ones that will suffer the most are precisely our continuators. Thus, it is the future, in this sense, what would be affected the most. So we see that this spiritual fatherhood also constitutes a big commitment with the future. And this deep commitment with the future is precisely the one that we find expressed in his letters. In the letters written in the in prison or in the gulag in general, in the Russian labor camps and in the prisons. So, this commitment with the future shows precisely that Florensky is not only interested in the work he has done, but that he is first and foremost preoccupied with the ones that are still to come. Right? Improving or trying to improve in this sense, everything that can help them preserve the memory of the truth, and therefore the experience of life. In the summer of 1937, the lager was turned into a special prison. From then on, he took the charge of a night guard of the iodine factory. Here the role changes. Now he can no longer work, and now he can only work as a night keeper. And again sentenced on November 25 of this year, 1937, and he's now forbidden to keep any kind of contact with his family. So it seems as though even this commitment with the future had to be ruled out at all costs. To silence it, conceal it, and to interrupt, let's say, the enormous effort that Florensky makes to look after the children. And we are these children. I think that Father Pavel never imagined that we would adhere to him in such a distant country, with such a great distance in between. Even temporal and historical, isn't it? But we can say that when Florensky is writing these letters, he was already thinking about us. And that should fill us with joy, right? And from that moment on, listen, from November 25, 1937, when Florensky is actually forbidden to keep contact with his family, and therefore he cannot receive, nor can he write. So, he is now sentenced to an absolute silence, to remain, let's say, immersed in an obscurity where no one else can know what happens. So, from this moment on, without the prisoner's traces, different versions started to spread. Some truly legendary about his death, that Leningrad's Civil State Office falsely registered, listen, falsely, on October 15, 1943. So, supposedly, in the records that were written, Pavel Florensky's death was registered on October 15, 1943. But today, thanks to a letter that was sent to the family on January 11, 1990, by the KGB, we know how things actually happened. Listen, it was until the year 1990. And what happened? How did things actually happen? After new accusations of counter-revolutionary propaganda, the headquarters of the NKVD, which is what later became the KGB of Leningrad, so this secret police that was in charge of control and security of the party, gathered together on November 25, 1937, gave the order to shoot Pavel Florensky. So, what we see is that, enough, the only way in which they could apparently get rid of this counter-revolutionary, this people's enemy, of this Orthodox priest, was to kill him off. In this case, it was by shooting him. And the sentence was executed on December 8, 1937. So, what we know is that the day that he really died was December 8. What do we celebrate on December 8? Exactly, the Immaculate Conception. So we see as well that it's something very beautiful. He dies on the day that the Virgin celebrates her Immaculate Conception. And this can probably make us think that indeed, Pavel Florensky was blessed by the Virgin Mary. And to acknowledge that things, right, don't depend on what we see. Because the same that we can condemn about the visible and even repugnant aspect of the church, the same thing we could condemn about Florensky's last days. And what we don't get to contemplate is that there's an extraordinary work of providence in such a luminous figure like this one. And his rehabilitation, listen, he died, he was shot in 1937. His rehabilitation And rehabilitation was something like to be, again, restored into the social space, to be reconsidered as another member of society, and not as someone who's detestable, or as someone who's forbidden or unmentionable. These were really unmentionable. It's not a game now. Here they were really unmentionable. His official rehabilitation didn't take place until the years 1958 and 1959. Until then. So, what we see in this sense is that Florensky, for example, goes from solitude in company, right? And here I mentioned this transit, and retaking it from a Mexican philosopher as well, unjustly forbidden, called Eduardo Nicol, Catholic extraordinary, very powerful, but unknown perhaps, or maybe even relegated into oblivion, Eduardo Nicol. Florensky goes from solitude in company to company in solitude. What does it mean? That solitude in company represented the incomprehension of everyone that surrounded him. Thus, to be immersed in an environment that was definitely hostile to him, and besides, extremely, painful. That's solitude in company. It now goes to company and solitude. Thus, to the communion of the saints. Because he, apparently, dies in a human solitude that, as we saw, it took a lot of years to really know what actually happened, but he is now already in this deep company that took him with open arms, and that from then on we could say that the fruit that Saint Father Pavel Florensky has borne around the world has continued bearing even more fruit. And it would even seem as though that this fruit can reach both higher dimensions and really unprecedented heights. Well, with this, we would now have the biographical profile. We will leave for next session the appeal of a wise priest. Alright? Thank you very much. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.